They told you astrology was demonic. They told you the Bible just condemned it outright. But what if I told you the church, actually used astrology and then like went through all this trouble to kind of erase the evidence? Welcome to the deep dive, everybody.
Oh, yeah.
Today, we're going deep. We're going to be exploring a pretty surprising connection between, Christianity and astrology, and we're going right to the source with this one. Lorenzo's study lays it all out. And this
Yeah.
isn't about, your daily horoscope in the newspaper.
Uh,
We're talking way back, right, to a time when astrology wasn't, just this fringe belief. It was like science, scripture, power, all rolled into one.
Oh, absolutely. And Lorenzo makes this really clear right from the start.
Yeah.
Back then, astronomy and astrology, they were the same thing. No distinction.
Exactly. So, like, what Lorenzo really highlights is just how important it was in the ancient world to understand the heavens, right? This wasn't some, theoretical thing. It was, like, vital,
No.
for stuff like agriculture, for planning, for military strategy.
Oh, for sure. I mean, you think about it, right? If you can predict the seasons, you can plan your crops. If you can navigate by the stars, well, that gives you a huge advantage in, like, warfare and trade.
Totally. And beyond that, their whole worldview, their spiritual understanding was, like, tied into these celestial events, interpreting omens, the destinies of rulers. This was serious business.
Yeah, absolutely. Like Lorenzo says, ignorance of the heavens was looked down upon, right? It wasn't just like, oh, you don't know much about the stars. It was like, you fundamentally misunderstand the world.
Yeah, like you're missing this essential piece of the puzzle. And, Lorenzo traces this whole fascination with the cosmos back to, like, its roots,
Yeah.
Babylon, Mesopotamia. These ancient civilizations, they were incredibly sophisticated when it came to studying the stars.
Oh, yeah, and they were doing it for millennia before, the Greeks and Romans even came on the scene. These priest astrologers, they had these incredibly precise maps of the sky. They were tracking planetary movements, figuring out their relationships to events on Earth.
Right, and Lorenzo's argument is that this Mesopotamian worldview, it wasn't just some historical curiosity, It had a major impact on, everything that came after it. He says it influenced the Old Testament, Jewish apocalyptic literature, even the Gospels.
And it's fascinating, right? Because you can see those echoes in the stories, these themes of cosmic order, of divine signs in the heavens. They really resonate with what Lorenzo's talking about.
Totally. And then you move over to ancient Egypt, and it's like this whole other level of cosmic reverence. It wasn't just about, observing the stars. The stars were gods.
Literally, yeah, immortal gods. And the zodiac, it wasn't just this abstract concept. It was physically represented in their temples.
Right. And the pharaohs,
Yeah.
their destinies were supposedly written in the stars, and the way they built their temples aligned with stars like Sirius. That was all about reflecting this, like, divine cosmic order.
Exactly. So you've got this backdrop, right? This ancient tradition of looking to the heavens for guidance, for meaning, and then along come the Greeks.
And they take this ancient understanding and they're like, okay, let's get philosophical with this. You've got Plato, Pythagoras, the Stoics, talking about this cosmic harmony, this interconnected universe.
Yeah. And it's really important to remember that, for the Greeks, philosophy wasn't just this abstract thing. It was about understanding the fundamental nature of reality, right? And for them, the cosmos was a huge part of that.
Right. It was like they were trying to decode the universe. And even Aristotle, who was, all about observation and logic, he was saying that celestial bodies had a direct influence on Earth.
Yeah. Like they weren't just these random lights in the sky. They were part of this like grand design, this cosmic dance that influenced everything down here.
Totally. And it's in this Hellenistic world, right? This
Right.
world that's steeped in astrological thinking. That's where Christianity pops up.
And this is a crucial point that Lorenzo makes, right? The early Christians, they didn't emerge in a vacuum. They were inheriting all of this rich intellectual and spiritual tradition that already existed.
Yeah, they weren't just like starting from scratch. They were building on something. And then you get to Rome and things get even more interesting because astrology becomes like a tool of the state, right?
Yeah.
Emperors are using their natal charts to like boost their image, legitimize their rule.
Yeah, it's like, look, the stars themselves have ordained me to be your leader. Augustus even had his natal chart put on coins, right? It's like cosmic propaganda.
Totally. And it wasn't just for show, Emperors were consulting astrologers for like major decisions, military campaigns, political moves, everything.
Yeah. And Julius Caesar, he was famous for this, like
Right.
timing his actions based on planetary alignments. It's crazy to think about, but, that was the world they lived in.
Right, like it wasn't even a question. And here's the thing that Lorenzo points out. Even early Christian leaders, they were like secretly using astrologers.
Yeah, and this is where things start to get like really complicated, right? Because
Yeah.
on the one hand, you have this growing Christian movement that's, supposed to be distinct from paganism.
Hmm.
But on the other hand, they're still operating within this like astrologically infused world.
Right, and this leads to one of the most interesting points in Lorenzo's study, the Magi, these, wise men from the East who show up in the gospel. Lorenzo's like, hold on, these guys were astrologers.
Flat out, yeah. They were reading the heavens, interpreting signs, following a star. They weren't just like wandering mystics. They were practitioners of a very specific, well-developed tradition.
Exactly. And here's the kicker. The New Testament, it doesn't condemn them.
Not at all. In fact, they're presented as like these revered figures.
Hmm.
They're the first Gentiles to recognize Jesus as the Messiah,
Yeah.
right? They
Mhm.
bring gifts, they worship him.
And Lorenzo's point is, this whole story, it kind of legitimizes astrology within the context of, like, the foundational narrative of
Mhm.
Christianity. It's like right there in the Bible, the gospel saying, hey, these astrologers, they got it right.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point, right? Because if you're going to later condemn astrology as like this evil pagan practice, well, how do you square that with this story?
Right. So Lorenzo, he's wrapping up this first part of his study, and he's basically saying that astrology in this period wasn't just some, side hobby. It was this serious, respected body of knowledge. And the church, when it comes onto the scene, it's entering a world that already speaks this language of the stars. And that, he says, sets the stage for what he calls a cover-up.
And that's what makes this whole thing so fascinating, right? Because you're talking about this hidden history, this connection that's been kind of swept under the rug.
Exactly. So, okay, this story of the Magi following a star, right? We all know it. It's in every nativity scene. But Lorenzo's saying, look closer. He points out that the Gospel of Matthew, it's really specific about these guys. They're foreigners, Gentiles, and most importantly, pagan astrologers.
And they're the first ones to recognize Jesus.
Hmm.
Not the high priests, not the scribes, not the religious authorities in Jerusalem, these astrologers from the East.
Right, and Lorenzo suggests they were probably Zoroastrians from Persia. These guys were trained in these sophisticated celestial sciences, and they saw some astronomical events, some sign in the heavens, and they interpreted it as like the birth of a divine king.
And Lorenzo quotes Matthew 2.2 directly, right? He says, "We saw his star in the east and we have come to worship him." And he makes this point that this isn't some metaphor, right? It's not just like a vision. This is astrological language.
Right. They're talking about observing a celestial body and interpreting its meaning. Maybe it was a planetary conjunction, or a supernova, or some specific alignment of the stars. The gospel doesn't say exactly what it was, but it makes it clear that these guys, they knew what they were doing.
Exactly. And it validates their method, right? And says, hey, these astrologers, they use their knowledge to find the Messiah.
And this, Lorenzo argues, is theologically huge. He's like, if the church is going to condemn astrology as like this pagan tool of the devil, then why did God choose to announce the birth of his son through a star? And two astrologers of all people.
Right. Why not some other way? Why not a direct revelation to the religious leaders of the time? Lorenzo's saying that in this story, the cosmos, it becomes the medium of revelation, and it's these pagan astrologers who hear it first.
Which is pretty wild when you think about it. So Lorenzo, he calls this the embarrassment of the Magi. He says that later theologians, they were like, okay, how do we explain this? And they tried to like downplay the whole astrology angle.
Yeah, they came up with these explanations like, oh, it was a supernatural star. God just created it for this one specific event, or he was just using a pagan practice to make a point. But Lorenzo argues that Matthew's account, it doesn't really support that.
Right. The Magi are presented as like these respected figures. Their gifts are prophetic. They find Jesus, they worship him, and there's no mention of anyone being like, hey guys, maybe you should ditch the whole astrology thing.
Exactly. They get it right by reading the stars, and the gospel validates that.
Yeah.
And Lorenzo wraps up this part of his study with this like really provocative question. He says, if astrology was always evil, why did God use it?
Yeah, good point. And
Right.
he says that the church's silence on this, the fact that they don't really address this directly, it suggests that they're trying to suppress the idea that the heavens might still be speaking, even if
Okay.
they don't want to hear it.
Right. So from there, Lorenzo shifts gears a little bit. He starts looking at the early church fathers, these influential thinkers and writers in the first few centuries of Christianity. And he makes this point that their views on astrology, they weren't just this like blanket rejection.
Right, because a lot of people think, oh, early church, they must have hated astrology. But Lorenzo's saying, no, it was way more complicated than that.
Yeah, they were engaging with these ideas in all sorts of different ways, and they were like arguing with each other, debating the finer points. It wasn't just this like monolithic stance.
Right, and it's important to remember that these guys, they weren't just operating in a vacuum, you know? They were living in a world that was deeply influenced by, like, Greek philosophy, Roman culture, this long tradition of looking to the stars. So their views on astrology, they reflected that complexity.
Exactly. So Lorenzo, he starts by looking at Origen. This is a guy who lives in the 3rd century, and he was a pretty influential theologian. And Origen, he didn't just, like, ignore astrology. He understood it, referenced it in his writings, engaged with it as part of this, like, broader intellectual discourse.
Right, so he was taking it seriously, you know? He wasn't just dismissing it out of hand. And Origen, he believed that the celestial realm, it was part of this rational, divinely created order.
Yes. So, like, for him, the stars and planets, they weren't just these random things. They were part of this grand design, this cosmic tapestry that God had woven.
Right. And Lorenzo quotes Origen as saying, there are heavenly signs and certain powers that influence earthly events. So he's acknowledging that, yeah, there's a connection there. The stars do have some kind of influence. But Lorenzo points out that Origen, he also cautioned against taking it too far, you know.
Yeah, like he didn't want people to think that their fate was totally predetermined by the stars. He still believed in free will and God's ultimate sovereignty.
Right. It was more like, the stars are giving you signs, you know. They're pointing to things, but you still have choices to make. And then Lorenzo looks at Clement of Alexandria. This guy was writing in the 2nd century. And he seems to have had a more, like, positive view of astrology than Origen.
Yeah, Clement was really into Greek philosophy, you know,
Yes.
and he had this idea that the stars were like letters in the sky spelling out God's messages.
This was a pretty cool way to put it.
Right, like the cosmos is this divine alphabet, and if you learn to read it, you can understand God's will. And Lorenzo says that Clement, he saw astrology as this potentially valid way of, like, interpreting those messages.
Right, as long as you approached it with, like, faith and humility, you
Yeah.
know, recognizing that God was ultimately in control. But then Lorenzo introduces Tertullian, who he calls the mood killer.
Oh, yeah. Tertullian was a whole other story. He was vehemently against astrology. But Lorenzo points out that his opposition, it wasn't just about theology, you know. It was more about maintaining a separation between Christianity and paganism.
Right. Like, Tertullian was really concerned about, you know, Christian communities being too influenced by pagan ideas and practices. And for him, astrology was like the epitome of that.
Yeah, Lorenzo quotes him as saying, astrologers are sorcerers, liars, even when they tell the truth.
So he's not holding back, right? He's basically saying, this stuff is evil, stay away from it.
But even Tertullian, Lorenzo points out, he makes this interesting distinction. He says that the stars, they influence the body, but not the soul.
Yeah, that's a really important nuance, right? Because it suggests that even in his condemnation, Tertullian acknowledged that there was some kind of connection there, some kind of influence. It's just he drew a line at the soul, you know, that was off limits.
Right, and that idea, it actually pops up later on with Thomas Aquinas.
Yeah.
But okay, now we get to Augustine. Lorenzo describes him as this torn genius, and it's kind of fitting because Augustine, he had a complicated relationship with astrology.
Oh, for sure. Like, Augustine, he had actually practiced astrology himself at one point, and he had found some of its predictions to be accurate. So he knew firsthand that there was something to it, you know? It wasn't just all nonsense.
Right, but then he converted to Christianity, and he became this huge figure in the church, and he ended up rejecting astrology. Lorenzo says that Augustine, he tried to attribute its apparent successes to, like, demonic influence, you know. He called it vanity, said it was a distraction from God.
Yeah. But it's interesting, right? Because Augustine, he never fully dismissed the idea that the stars could have some kind of effect. And he has this famous quote, you know, the stars may incline us, but they do not compel us.
Yeah, that's the one. And Lorenzo points out that that quote, it becomes like the cornerstone of the church's later approach to astrology.
Yeah.
It allows them to acknowledge that, yeah, maybe there's some influence there, but it's not deterministic, you know. It doesn't take away your free will. Exactly. And Lorenzo's argument is that this shift, this move away from the more nuanced views of guys like Origen and Clement towards this more like condemnatory stance, it's not just about theology, it's about power.
Right, because if people can just look to the stars and figure things out for themselves, well, then what need do they have for the church, you know? For priests, for doctrines, for all of that.
Exactly. It's like If the heavens are this, like, direct line to God, then that kind of undermines the whole idea of the church as the mediator, you know?
Totally. And Lorenzo, he wraps up this section on the church fathers by saying that they didn't like totally reject astrology, right? They debated it, they argued about it, they held different views. But the point is, they were all operating within this framework that acknowledged the divine significance of the heavens.
Yeah, and he quotes Psalm 19.1 here, right? The heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament proclaims the work of his hands. So it's not like they were denying that the cosmos was important, it's just they were trying to control how it was interpreted.
Exactly. So now we get to the juicy stuff. This is the part of Lorenzo's study where he really starts to dig into what he calls the erasure, this period where the church goes from like debating astrology to actively suppressing it.
Yeah. And Lorenzo makes this really bold claim. He says that astrology didn't just fade away because it was like scientifically debunked or whatever. He says it was deliberately suppressed because it was dangerous to the church's power.
Yeah, he's not pulling any punches here. And it makes sense when you think about it, right? Because if people believe that they can find truth and guidance in the stars, well, then they don't necessarily need the church to tell them what to think.
Exactly. And Lorenzo, he points to the reign of Constantine in the 4th century as this like pivotal moment.
Yeah.
Because before Constantine, Christianity was, this persecuted minority. But then Constantine comes along, he legalizes Christianity, and suddenly it's the official religion of the Roman Empire.
Right. So it goes from being this like underground movement to this powerful institution almost overnight. And Lorenzo argues that this shift, it created this need for the church to really differentiate itself from paganism, to show that they were distinct, that they had their own unique beliefs and practices.
And paganism at that time, it was deeply intertwined with astrology, right?
Sure.
Everything from their rituals to their calendars was influenced by the stars.
Yeah.
So if Christianity wanted to, stand apart, they had to distance themselves from that.
Totally. And Lorenzo suggests that if they didn't, if they seemed too similar to paganism, it might have been harder to convert people. So they go into PR mode, right?
Yeah.
They start denouncing astrology as this silly superstition, this dangerous pagan practice. But here's the thing. They keep using it themselves.
Yeah, that's the hypocrisy that Lorenzo keeps coming back to.
Yeah.
They're telling people, the stars have no dominion over you. Our allegiance is to God alone. But then they're quietly using lunar cycles to calculate Easter.
Right. And they're aligning their liturgical year with the solstices and equinoxes. All these things that are rooted in, astronomical observation and understanding the movements of the stars.
Yeah. It's like they're trying to have it both ways. Astrology is bad, but we'll just keep using it for our own purposes.
And Lorenzo, he argues that the real issue here, the thing that the church was really afraid of, it was this idea of spiritual autonomy.
Yeah.
That if people could just look to the heavens and figure things out for themselves, then they wouldn't need the church as much.
Right. Because if you can understand the cosmic order, if you can interpret the stars and find your own meaning, then you don't need a priest to tell you what God wants.
Exactly. And Lorenzo, he calls the stars the original direct-to-God hotline, which is such a great way to put it.
It really is, right? It's like you bypass the middleman, you go straight to the source. And that, for a hierarchical institution like the church, that was a huge threat.
Totally. So, okay, the church is we got to crack down on this astrology stuff. So what do? Lorenzo lays it all out. Church councils start issuing these pronouncements against astrology, calling it divination, forbidden. Clerics are banned from consulting astrologers.
And lay people. They're told that astrology is basically witchcraft.
Right.
Right? It's heresy, it's demonic, it's going to lead you straight to hell.
Yeah, it's they're trying to scare people away from it. And even making personal birth charts, that becomes taboo.
Yeah, it's like this whole system of knowledge that's been around for centuries, suddenly it's off limits. Yep. And Lorenzo, he highlights this blatant hypocrisy. He says, even as these prohibitions are being enforced, popes and bishops are still using astrology behind closed doors.
Right. It's do as we say, not as we do. And Lorenzo, he gives some pretty specific examples. He talks about Pope Sixtus V, who commissioned the Sistine Chapel, but he also commissioned astrological forecasts for important papal decisions.
Yeah, and Pope Julius II, this guy was a warrior pope, right?
Mm-hmm.
Famous for his military campaigns. And he supposedly consulted astrologers before major battles. And Pope Leo X, who was a huge patron of the arts during the Renaissance, he had a whole staff of court astrologers.
So it's astrology is superstition for the masses, but cosmic guidings for the elite.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
And Lorenzo, he throws in this little detail that I think is just perfect. He points out that the Vatican has an observatory, the Spicola Vaticana, founded in 1582.
Wait, the Vatican has an observatory?
Yep, and it's still operating today, staffed by Jesuit astronomers, some of whom, Lorenzo notes, acknowledge that, yes, celestial rhythms do have an influence on Earth.
So it's like, if the church really believed that the stars were irrelevant or demonic, why would they have an observatory? Why would they be studying the heavens so closely?
It's a good question, right? And Lorenzo's answer is that the church never really stopped believing in the power of the heavens. They just wanted to control the interpretation.
Right, because if they control the interpretation, then they control the narrative, they control the power. And then Lorenzo, he takes this even further. He starts talking about the church calendar, all the holidays, the feast days, all of that. And he argues that the whole thing is based on astrological principles.
Yeah, this is where it gets really interesting, because we take the church calendar for granted, right?
Yeah.
But Lorenzo's saying, look closer. The timing of these events, it's not random.
Right, like Easter. It's calculated based on the lunar cycle, on the vernal equinox, that's straight up lunar astrology, and Christmas. It's timed around the winter solstice.
Yeah, a pagan tradition celebrating the rebirth of the sun. And Lorenzo even suggests that a lot of the feast days for Mary and the saints, they correspond with significant planetary alignments, equinoxes, harvest moons, all of that.
So he's basically saying that the church calendar is not anti-astrology. It's built on astrology. But it's all coded in dogma,
Yeah.
to hide the origins.
Right. It's like, we're not doing astrology, we're just following the ancient traditions of the church. Wink, wink.
Exactly. So Lorenzo, he sums up this whole section on hypocrisy by saying that, look, the church told people astrology was heresy. But the popes used it, the bishops benefited from it, the calendar depended on it, and the Vatican observed the heavens.
It's like they confiscated this knowledge,
Yeah.
They took it for themselves and kept it hidden from everyone else.
Right, and the real hypocrisy wasn't that they believed in astrology, it's that they denied everyone else access to it.
Yeah.
So now we get to the last part of Lorenzo's study, and he calls it Why This Still Matters. And this is where he shifts from historical analysis to what does all of this mean for us today?
Right, because this isn't just some dusty old history lesson.
Yeah.
It's relevant to what's happening right now.
Yeah.
With this whole resurgence of interest in astrology and all these other spiritual practices.
Exactly. And Lorenzo, he starts off by saying that the stars themselves, they were never the real threat. They're just celestial bodies. They're neutral. What the church was really afraid of, he says, was empowered people. People who could access knowledge and meaning directly without needing the church as an intermediary.
And he makes this really interesting comparison,
Yeah.
He compares the suppression of astrology to the historical resistance to translating the Bible into vernacular languages.
Right, because once people could read the Bible in their own language, they could interpret it for themselves, right? They didn't need the priests to tell them what it meant.
And Lorenzo's saying that astrology, it was kind of similar. It was this way for people to understand the divine order, to find their own purpose, without needing the church to explain it to them.
Totally. And he goes on to say that astrology, it doesn't necessarily contradict religious faith. In fact, it can complement it. Faith says that the universe is divinely ordered, and astrology shows you that order in the heavens.
Yeah, it's like faith tells you that God speaks, and astrology suggests that he speaks through the stars.
Right. It's like a different language, a different way of understanding the same truth. And Lorenzo, he even quotes Psalm 147.4. He counts the number of the stars. He calls them all by name.
So he's saying that the stars, they're not these demonic entities, They're part of God's creation. They're meant to be understood.
Right. They're messengers, not enemies. And this leads to Lorenzo's take on the whole modern revival of astrology and tarot and all these other practices. He's saying that this isn't about people rejecting God, It's about them searching for meaning and connection outside of these, traditional religious structures.
Yeah, because for a lot of people, those structures aren't working anymore. They're not providing the answers. They're not meeting their needs. So they're looking elsewhere.
Exactly. And Lorenzo, he sees this as a good thing. He calls it a reclaiming of knowledge that was deliberately suppressed. It's about people taking back their spiritual autonomy, their right to connect with the divine in their own way.
And his final thought on this is just beautiful, He says, the heavens declare the glory of God, and we're finally listening again.
Chills. So now we get to Lorenzo's concluding monologue, right? He's going to wrap it all up, tie it all together.
Yeah. And it's a powerful one. He starts by reminding us of the central lie, this idea that astrology is sinful, that it's pagan, when in reality, the church used it first. They built their whole calendar around it. Their leaders consulted astrologers. They observed the heavens.
Right, they just didn't want anyone else to do it. And he brings back the Magi, those revered astrologers who were guided by the stars. He's saying, look, this was never about truth versus falsehood. It was about power.
Yeah. The church suppressed astrology because it freed people. It gave them a way to connect with the cosmos, to find answers without needing the church as a gatekeeper. And then Lorenzo, he gets really provocative. He starts asking these questions like, what else has been suppressed? What other truths have been hidden away? What if the stars have always been speaking, but we were just told to ignore them?
And it's such a mind-blowing thought. What if there's this whole other layer of reality, this whole other way of understanding the universe that's been kept from us?
And Lorenzo, he frames this resurgence of interest in astrology and all these other practices as a return to that. It's about breaking free from those old structures, from those limitations.
And then he hits us with this powerful call to action. He says, go outside, look at the sky, and remember, they lied. The stars never stopped speaking. You just stopped being allowed to listen.
And he ends with this amazing line. He says, this is the beginning of your spiritual jailbreak.
So go outside, folks, look up, and listen.
Yeah, listen to what the stars are telling you.
They've been waiting a long time for you to tune back in.